So what I'm going to talk about today is that space settlements is not just engineering. It is not just how to build it. There's a lot more to it. You can have the best engineers in the world, but you can still never fully create a space settlement that will actually function. So what I'm going to talk about is both the engineering and the other softer side of it. With that, let's get started. And let's first address the elephant in the room, so to speak. Why do we actually even go into space? So there's a few key reasons. One of them is resources. There's about 7 billion people on Earth, and there's 11 billion people predicted by 2025. So we need the resources to house these people, give these people food, shelter, and all of these things. And Earth will provide a huge amount of them, but it may not provide all of them. So we can use space as a great alternative. Another thing is the energy needed for these people and for the people we currently have, because as we develop as a society, we will only consume more energy. So where can we get these alternative energy sources? A lot of people believe space is that place. You might have heard of things like space-based solar power, where you have solar panels in space. Something like that could be a great result of it. Now, another side of it is actually testing the limits of science. Where does our current model for how the world and the universe works, where does that break down? And space is a great testing space for that. And another thing, which is probably the biggest thing, is innovation. There's so much innovation that has come from space. Insulation, for example, a lot of it has come from space. A lot of parts of your computer and a lot of the protective wear of the computer, that has come from space as well. And that has had a tremendous impact on our lives around us. So let's actually look at what is needed for a space settlement. So let's start off with the obvious, the engineering and the technology. If you don't have the engineering or the technology, you can't actually get it there. So we need to look. So I'll talk about that. As well as that, there's the softer side. There's food, for example. You need to keep everyone fed, and there's only so much space you have to do that. Medicine is another thing. Where do you get medicine from? How will you produce it? Will you do complex procedures on the settlement, or will you have to ship them to Earth to do them? All of these things have to be addressed. Mental well-being is often overlooked, but I doubt many of you would like to sit and stay for the rest of your life in a metal box with about 200 to 300 other people. So for this reason, we need to look at other ways. We need to look at ways of dealing with mental well-being. Governance and economics. How will you structure your settlement? Who runs it? And how will the economics work? How will money work? These are all things that need to be addressed. And there's obviously manufacturing and maintenance so that it continues and it's self-sustained. And education so that later years will still be able to continue the space settlement. Now, all of these need to be addressed. I'll only talk about a few of them, but feel free to ask me questions about all of them. So let's start off with technology. So you might have heard recently of the Mars flight Ingenuity. And that is a helicopter which has currently been made and is currently flying on Mars. Now, what this helicopter essentially allows us to do is it allows us to see much further and much more quickly into places. And what this means is that we have a very is that we can then create a large amount of we can very quickly explore a planet in a high amount of depth when we make a settlement there, which will be very useful for the continuation of the settlement. So then there's a new material out there you might have heard of, which is called graphene. It's making the rounds everywhere. It's a super strong material. Now, what it does is it is a sheet of carbon atoms. So you have graphite in your pencil. And what graphite is, it's a lot of layers of graphene. And those layers can slide. And one of those layers is extremely strong. It's a bit like taking a sheet of paper and trying to rip it apart like this. You're going to struggle to do it. However, if you instead have a if you instead try to rip it, it's very easy. And that's similar with graphene. It's very easy to move and shape, but also is extremely strong, which gives us which is very important when you're building things in space, because it can sustain a huge amount of pressure. So probably the biggest recent invention has been reusable spacecraft. And this is things like Falcon 9 or Falcon Heavy. Now, and you might have actually heard of these. These are, so with the normal spacecraft, what happens? As it goes up, the different parts of it fall off, and you just have the payload that remains. And those different parts fall back to Earth, and they crash down. And a lot of the time, they're either not reusable, or if they are, it will take hundreds or thousands of man-hours to get these into a usable form. And it costs a huge amount. So why don't we just make these individual pieces land? Now, that is exactly what Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy are planning on doing. So you can see in this video, Falcon 9, hopefully, that as it comes back down, it slowly rotates itself, and it allows it, and that little bit of fuel that it keeps left, it burns it up, and it allows it to actually land. And this is extremely helpful, because then the costs aren't entirely to service it. It's mostly just a little bit of servicing and refueling it, which has made the cost of space flight go down from about $100,000 per kilogram to about $2,000 to $3,000 per kilogram, which is drastically lower, and has allowed smaller companies, such as you might have heard of CubeSat, to create small satellites which can go into space for a much lower cost. Now, there's new technology. This is called space elevators and skyhook systems. They're two related systems which look at creating a greener way of getting into space and a much cheaper way of getting into space. So let's start off with looking at space elevators. So a space elevator is actually pretty much how it sounds. It is just a big elevator which goes into space. You have two different parts to it. You have one going up, one going down, and this can allow a lot of travel. So you can take material straight up to geostationary orbit, and at a very low cost as well, because it's just the cost of the electricity. So you're looking at a few cents or per kilogram. So that is so much lower, and will allow space flight to become very easily commercialized. And now skyhook systems are a bit different. So a skyhook, hopefully you can see this, it's when you have a satellite, it comes out, and what the idea is that you have like a cable which comes out from the satellite, and that has a clip of some sort on it. And as you can see, the skyhook comes in, and the grabber comes around, and it grabs the satellite, and it flings it out of Earth's orbit. So it grabs onto the satellite with the grabber, as you can see, and it throws it. And this means that you only need to get to low Earth orbit, or maybe even lower, to get something from Earth to outer space. And this could vastly decrease travel times. And if you start putting them on things like Mars or other planets, you can start to have harbors where you can quickly move things from one to the other, and they can and satellites can just bounce across this, which would vastly reduce costs. So you might have heard of also Artemis. That's restarting the Apollo missions to the moon. And This will be a huge step in the right direction, in my opinion, because what it will allow us to do is it will allow us to open up the moon for construction purposes in the future, and maybe we can build a moon base, which will be ideal for us in the long term to make um, settlements outside of just our close proximity. So there's the other side, which is telescopes, things like the James Webb Telescope, which you may have heard of, which is a new telescope which has come out and it has been produced and it's now operational. And it has allowed us to see much better quality images than anything else has ever allowed us to do of outer space. And it has allowed us to see much further and in much more detail than anywhere else. Then there's also cleaning satellites. I'll talk about these more later on, but it's a frequently overlooked topic. It's currently around Earth, we have billions of tiny, tiny particles, or even larger spacecraft, which are just junk. They're floating around there. They don't have any purpose, and they can very easily cause damage to satellites or whatever we send up. And this could be a big problem in the future for the longevity of us going into space. So let's now look at food. How will we produce food? So there's two sides, plant-based food and meat-based food. So how we produce meat first. We can't actually take animals or such up there. That's unrealistic. So what we can do is artificially produce meat. We've actually already been doing this on Earth in the form of corn. Now, what this is essentially is you create this material called mycoproteins, and you can do this by taking organic waste and crushing it and adding the fungus Fusarium venetatum, which releases these mycoproteins, which you can then use to create these foods. And what this also does is it conserves the entire biomass of the settlement, and this is very important because there's only a set amount of biomass, and if we're not taking in any more biomass, we have to make sure we conserve as much of it as is possible. Now, the other thing is hydroponics, and you might have seen these in person before, and so imagine an entire apple tree, and what do you actually want of the apple tree as the consumer? You just want the apple. Now, what if we can actually just produce the apple and a little bit of stalk? We can actually do this with hydroponics. You put the cutting in a certain environment, and what it does is it allows it to grow on its own, and this produces your fruit, which is extremely helpful because it reduces space and it increases efficiency. And these are the two most important things in space. So now let's look at energy. So we need to figure out a way of doing this without relying on the sun, because if we have, say, a base on a rotating planet, for example, on a fast rotating planet, or if we're looking at interstellar flight, we need to figure out a way of creating energy without relying on the sun. So the tried and tested method is fission. The other method I'll come on to is fusion. So fission reactions is basically where you have a big heavy metal, something like uranium-235, and what happens is a neutron hits it, and this absorbs the neutron, but it's very unstable, and it quickly breaks apart, releasing more neutrons, and this produces a huge amount of energy. Now, fusion reactions, on the other hand, are a bit different. You have two nucleons of fairly light mass, and they collide with each other, and they produce a heavier nucleus. And this also produces a huge amount of energy. The problem with fusion is that it requires a very, very high temperature and pressure, which means we haven't been able to make energy efficient fusion before. So because it is actually so hot, it can reach 15,000 degrees Celsius. And that is very hot. So we need to make sure it doesn't come into contact with any of the surfaces because it will just burn right through them. So we can do this by actually magnetizing it, because inside of it, it's actually a plasma. It's so hot it's a plasma. Electrons are ripped apart from their nucleuses. And what this means is that they're all charged particles. And by putting a magnetic field around it, which is basically just a big charge, which is a lot of charges in a certain direction, it can direct this and make it into a current. And this means that you have a very much lower chance of it hitting the side, and it produces a huge amount of energy. So now let's look at space policy, which is an often overlooked thing. So currently, space is actually pretty closed off. Only if you have a huge amount of money, or if you are already a big business, or if you're a university, you will actually be able to send anything into space. And what this inherently means is that there's not very much competition between different governments or companies. So it means that space is and it means that you have very inefficient things in space. Whereas you can increase this efficiency much higher if you have more smaller companies getting into it. And obviously, there's also a lack of cooperation between governments and companies. For example, SpaceX should be looking at governments and saying, we can supply your space traveling needs, and you give us the satellites, and we will work together. But this doesn't happen yet. And the other side is actually cleaning up space. This picture you see here, every single point which is colored, other than the Earth, is a piece of space junk. It's like a huge mesh surrounding Earth. And what this does is it means that we have a lot of things which can go wrong if you send something up and it collides with one of these. And these are moving at huge speeds, which are measured in percentages of light. And which means if you hit something, that it's going to go through and it's going to cause a huge amount of damage. So we need to clean this up. But there's a problem there. Who actually owns that thing? Because it's still the property of the person who put it up there. And that means that you can't exactly touch it until that person revokes their ownership of it. And that creates a problem. You have a lot of old satellites from the 50s or the 60s, which are just there, and you can't really get rid of them. So that needs to be figured out. So now we look at governing structures and how the government can work. So there's a range of possibilities. So let's start off with the economic system. So there's two types of economy in general. You have a market economy and you have a command economy. And the market economy is when you have companies setting their own prices, and it depends on the demand and the supply of those goods. And the problem you will run into is that while it's very efficient, in a settlement, there's only so many resources you can actually have, and there's very little space for manufacturing. So you need to make sure, so let's say a lot of people want pencils. Well, what will the, say, full factories start doing? They will start building pencils in huge numbers because that's what people want, right? But the problem with this is that there's no one building anything else. So that's a problem that needs to be addressed. On the other side, you have a command economy, which while it will address that, it's also very inefficient. So you need somewhere in between. So, and that will probably fall close to the command economy because there's very little there's very little leeway for things to go wrong. Now, there's another thing, which is decision-making systems. How do you decide who is in power? What should happen? So there's either a complete democracy where you have everyone vote on everything, or you can have a federal sort of democracy where you have people vote in candidates who will vote on their behalf. So that's how you could work in a democracy, which is also pretty similar to how a republic works. And another system is a dictatorship where you have one person ruling. Now, what this means is that compared to a democracy, it's very fast. But obviously, if you have one person who says what says what hundreds of people want, that's very problematic because all these people have different ideas, and you need to figure. And a dictatorship would fly in the face of all of that. Now, a republic is similar to a federal system, which I mentioned earlier, but it's a system without a monarchy, and that's pretty much how it works. An aristocracy, on the other hand, is where you have rule by money. Whoever has the most amount of money is in power, and this is obviously problematic because there's not if then people want to hoard wealth, and when there's only a set amount of possible wealth you can actually have, it could create a huge wealth gap. And also, these people who are super wealthy will not always at times not have the same goals as those who are poorer. So that needs to be figured out. So that's a huge problem with aristocracy. Sorry, monarchy is similar to a dictatorship, except it's hereditary. Whoever are these children of the monarch will then become the monarch. And the last idea is anarchy, and anarchy pretty much combines democracy, but it doesn't have a system. It doesn't have a law enforcement system as much. So it's a big problem, and it probably won't work in a small environment. There's also the problem of diversity of opinions. You have to have new ideas constantly coming into the government. Otherwise, it's just going to stay the same, and there'll be no progress. And the reason why this comes up is because there's a phenomenon called groupthink, which is a psychological phenomenon within which if you have a few hundred people and a lot of people believe the same thing, what you'll find is over time, those other people will slowly believe the same thing, whether due to peer pressure, and eventually they'll think that's the best idea. And that's a big problem in group because you only have a few hundred people. And if they all think one way, while it may make things fast, it may not always be good for the long-term survivability of the settlement. So now we have to look at medicine in space and things like microgravity. So in space, in microgravity, you might already know this, but there's nothing on Earth. There's a lot of gravity acting against you. You constantly need to engage muscles, have strong bones to keep yourself upright. But in space, there isn't this. So there's been a study where there was 2 astronauts who went into space for a year, and they did a huge amount of exercise and everything. But because there wasn't any gravity, they lost about 20% in muscle mass, and their muscles atrophied, and their bone density reduced by about 50%. Which caused long-term osteoporosis. And if this happens in space, if this happens in microgravity, we need to figure out a way of creating gravity, because even though these guys were exercising 4 hours a day, it still wasn't enough. So this is something we need to look at. So what are the methods of creating artificial gravity? So the big method is using a big spinning wheel, something like this. And as it spins, there's a lot of centrifugal force. And that centrifugal force pushes outwards, and it pushes people into the wall. And that means that you can have gravity if it spins at the right speed. And this is very, very, very good because it'll mean that people retain muscle mass and bone density, and it's means that there won't be things like collapses and such. Now, there's another thing, medicine. How will you produce medicine? So as much as possible, you want to make these medicines being able to produce naturally from plants and such, because otherwise you have, because synthetically creating medicine can be very expensive if done on a small scale. And it is also extremely inefficient on a small scale. And there's also a short supply. So there'll inevitably be a short supply of it. So, and also complex procedures, which will only be needed to be done once in every 10 years. Do you want to keep people who have expertise in those procedures, which will rarely ever be used? Or do you want to conduct those procedures on Earth? That's a question that has to be answered for space settlements, because you cannot have lots of redundant things which are only useful for 1 hour every 10 years. So that needs to be looked at. But there's another thing, day-to-day schedules. Currently, what you do, you wake up at about 6 o'clock or earlier or later, and you go to school. But that's because the sun that's because the sun rises about 6 o'clock or whenever, and you need to be at school by a certain time because of the sun rising. This is called your circadian rhythm, when you eat, when you wake up, when you sleep. And this doesn't exist in space because obviously there's no sun rising and falling in space. So how will you deal with that? This is a problem. If you have if you need to create a schedule and you can optimize it to how people will work, and this needs a lot of research and analysis, and this will take hundreds of years to be able to perfect. And we need to have a look at this in depth, because without it, you could have a lot of people who may be very fit, who may be very good, working very inefficiently and very poorly as a result. So mental health. So as you can see, this is a picture of the ISS. Now, the thing about the ISS is that it's a very small space, and there's only about 10 or 12 other people on it. And if you're staying for a prolonged period of time, with that few people, you're going to have a lot of psychological impacts on your life. There's not much social interaction, and what this does is it will reduce your overall effectiveness as a person and in the workforce. And this is obviously a big problem, because if you don't have as it can have like drastic impacts, including things like mental breakdowns happening more often. So this needs to be addressed. There's also development of children. How will children develop in these environments as from birth? And that has to be looked at, because it could cause huge adverse effects on the development of the brain structures in a child. And what is a possible solution is using things like hydroponic areas as sort of nature, because people have been seen to work a lot better within nature. So to summarize, who do we actually need for a settlement? We need people like engineers to create the settlement, lawyers to create the law in a settlement, as well as the space policy I was talking about, biologists for the medical side and the and all of that. We need politicians for creating those space policies, economists to create good and robust economic systems, psychologists for the mental health, artists also for mental health, and because art has a profound impact on people, and teachers to teach people in education. And there's so many more than this. This is just a brief summary of the big ones. Thank you very much for listening. I'll hand over to Mr. Mars and I'll have questions. Thank you.
Okay, guys, I think Mr. Roudra is already done presenting. You have any questions you want to ask Mr. Roudra? Yeah, come. Stay there with the camera. Okay. Oh. Oh, you. Oh my God. Maybe let's go there.
So good morning, Mr. Rudra. My question is, what kind of resources are there in space?
Wait, Rudra. Wait.
Good morning, Mr. Rudra. My question is, what resources are there in space?
Shall I answer? Okay. So in space, what you have is you have a lot of asteroids, and these asteroids, they have a huge amount of rare earth metals, things like uranium or heavy metals, and these are very useful for Earth. And in general, these are very useful. Things like tungsten, for example, is abundant on Type M satellites, and sorry, Type M asteroids. Sorry, and this is something we can easily capitalize on. As well as that, a single asteroid can holds trillions and trillions worth of dollars of metals, and this is a tremendous thing which we can tap into. As well as this, on Earth you have the atmosphere, and it blocks out a lot of sunlight. So if you have things like a solar panel in space, which can absorb more sunlight and then transmit that back to Earth in some method, you can have a lot of energy being given to Earth very quickly and much greener than we currently do. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Roudra, there's another question from Tinlo on year seven. Is the year six or year seven? Tinlo. Year seven. So why don't they have doctors in the people for space settlement? The one that you showed a while ago. Doctors.
Oh, that was entirely my fault. I should have said that. I should have actually put it in here. But yes, doctors are extremely important in space. And I was hoping that would come under biologists, but I didn't make that clear.
Yeah. And Adrian is asking, have you been to space?
No, unfortunately not. I plan to, but not yet.
So he's pushing. Okay. Any more other questions? Yes. Suchi.
Think you show yourself. You show yourself. Move backward. Move backward. Move backward. I don't think it's not enough. I don't think it's not enough. You show yourself. Move backward.
Out of everything in space, what do you find the most interesting, or what is the main thing that got you into space element?
That's a very good question. So my interest in space and in space settlements was peaked when I started learning about how rockets work, and I got very interested. Sorry, was there some?
Yeah, no issues. Just continue.
Okay. Oh, okay. Sorry. So I was very interested in how rockets worked, and from there I had a bit of a deep dive, and I went into space, and I found the entire thing very interesting. And I thought, well, long-term into space, how will we get there? And that's when I came across space settlements and their design and some concept ideas. And this is really what got me interested in it.
Any more questions? Yes, Farhan?
Do you think someone could live in space for the rest of their lives? Or do you think there will be some sort of limit that the body can handle what's being in space?
So yeah, I talked about this in a little bit of depth, but you're absolutely right. In living in space is very difficult, and there will be probably a point in space where someone cannot handle it. And in microgravity, where you don't have where there's very minimal gravity, there is obviously the problem that if people's bones and mass and muscle mass completely atrophy, then they won't be able to actually live in space and have a good quality of life in space. So if you can create gravity somehow with the spinning disc, spinning wheel type thing I showed you, if you can create it with that, you can increase the time someone can possibly stay in space and make that into their entire lifetime. But currently, I don't think we have the technology to make someone live forever in space.
Okay, any more questions from the students? Oh, Ms. Madhu wants to ask question.
Very good morning, Roudra. Do you have school today? Are you going to school later, or are you not going to school today? You are going to school later.
Yeah, I am.
This is Madhu. We are actually from the same place, Kolkata. Let me tell you this, you've made us very proud.
Thank you.
Our mom is Mr. Krish's friend, Krish is my friend. But unfortunately, I don't know your mom. But I'm the principal for this campus. It's an honor to have you with us. I personally strongly believe that my grandchildren will be actually living in space, and if I live up to that age, I will probably be traveling to space to visit my grandchildren. But I have two questions for you. Number one, how soon do you think this is going to be possible? According to you, because you have a vast knowledge. So this is my first question. My second question would be, I mean, one of my students asked, but I missed that part. What got you drawn into this? I mean, everybody's talking about space, everybody's talking about robotics, coding, but you as a 15-year-old child, achieving what you have achieved and what you are doing, which is amazing. What got you into all this? So just these two questions for you. And thank you very much for doing this for us, Roudra. Thank you. I hope to see you sometime soon, maybe in our hometown, or I'll come to be doing it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your kind words. So in response to your first question, I would say that that it might be possible to create a functioning space settlement, maybe as a proof of concept in the next 50 years, which would probably be something like a lunar base, and you could have something like a moon base. And this will be this can use technology which we currently have. The problem is investment and opening up space further to new investors. And this is something that can happen in a lot sooner than a lot of people think. And the other side is for me getting into space. I talked about my interest in rockets and how rockets work, and that was piqued by my interest in the Cold War. So as I learned how rockets work, and then I learned how space travel works, I then thought, okay, longevity of space, long-term impact into space. So I started watching a lot of videos from this person called Kurzgesagt, And that really got me into space, and I started doing a deep dive. I started reading research and a lot of journals about space. And from there, I learned a lot more. And that's what got me into space in general. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Roudra. We still have a few more students here or pupils to ask questions. May I ask Rizky to come here? Rizky, come here now.
Fingers off.
You like the design that you came up with?
Pardon?
You like the design that you came up with?
Yes, I haven't actually talked about it at all actually in this one, but just to summarize, it was a fusion reactor attached to a spinning wheel in space, and there's a lot of inside things. But I actually liked the design I came up with. Yes, thank you. Does that answer your question?
Okay, next.
Were you proud of your invention that you made?
Pardon?
Are you proud of the invention that you have made?
Sorry, I can't hear you. It's
Roudra is asking if you are proud of the inventions that you have made.
So I've not actually invented anything. I just brought a few ideas together, and of that I am very proud. Yes. Thank you.
Can we make him bigger?
Roudra, can we ask you to stop sharing so that we can see your handsome face?
Fun?
Everybody wants to see you actually. You can stop sharing.
Oh,
Stop
okay.
sharing.
Sorry. Yeah, of course. My bad. Sorry.
Okay, that's good. Okay. Any further questions? There's a question coming from William of 7U. I think it is in the chat box. How would the peace and order in space would likely be? Yeah.
Right. So space wars and such. That's an interesting idea. If you have like breakaway things, then you could, in theory, have a space war. And currently, something like that and law and order in space is a very difficult topic. You can't exactly have a police force because the time it takes to get from one settlement to the other, or from let's say Mars to Earth, is measured in days. It will take, so you need to have a look at this. So that's a very important point, like keeping law and order between settlements in space. And in space itself, you probably need a police force within every settlement. So very interesting point. Thank you.
I think there's one more that's very interesting. Would you think planning to settle in space would deplete the resources of the Earth?
Yes. I think currently on Earth we have only a certain amount of resources, and while we can in theory supply everyone with them, with our current system it would need to be completely with the way the world works, we need to sort of separate that out exactly, and that has a lot of complications. So space is very much the alternative for those resources, and it will definitely supplement Earth's resources. I think that answers your question.
Thank you for that. Any more further questions? Suchi, have a follow-up question, I think. Natamia?
No. What do you think is the biggest challenge we are facing right now to live in space?
So I think the biggest challenge is probably twofold. One, the health side, so microgravity, and because to create that big wheel, it takes a lot of material, and that's a huge hurdle we need to cross over, and the technology behind all of that. The other side is also the engineering side, as well as the investment side. So currently we have a large amount of technology, but for something like a settlement, we'll need more technology. We can probably create a lunar base at this point, but the problem with that is that there's no investment into it. No one sees that as an opportunity. The current concept for a Mars base that Elon Musk has, that is probably the closest thing we have to a lunar, to creating a settlement, and that does not have the investment that it needs to actually take off. And I think investment is probably a big part of the answer to your question.
Okay, thank you, Roudra. This one, I've heard from Mr. Chris that you have done thesis. Is that a thesis? Can you discuss a little bit about what you have done on your thesis?
So the thesis was just a big write-up of my design, and analyzing it. So it basically revolved around a few major points. So you have one of them being the mental health section and the health in general section. That was a big part of what I spoke about. And obviously the engineering, the construction ideas. So I decided to go with a skyhook I talked about. And with that, you can use something like a with a scramjet plane, which is a very, very fast moving plane, and you have a huge load. So that was my idea for how you can deal with the what do you call it? So with the high weight and the tonnage that you need to take into space and the cost. So and that was one side of what I spoke about. The other side was the more softer stuff, the economics and the government structure. So I opted for a devolved democracy, which basically means that people are able to vote for candidates for about a 50-to-1 ratio. And that's how the democratic system would work. It would be like a big parliament, and that's that system. Then I looked a lot at the smaller microeconomics of how people will be paid, and how food will work, and all of this side. So yeah, those were the big parts of my thesis, of my paper. Yeah, thank you for your questions.
Thank you very much, Roudra. I think we will end it here because Roudra will still be going to school. Okay, so thank you very much.
Thank you, guys. Thank you for having me.
Happy to see you again. Any final word?
Junlok wants to ask Mr. Mars. Hello, Junlok.
Oh, Junlok wants to ask one more thing. Junlok, you can proceed.
I'm Junlok from year 7. How on Earth, why is the skyhook not affected by the Earth and the Moon's gravity?
Pardon? Sorry.
Why is the skyhook not affected by the Earth and the Moon's gravity?
Right. So you might have heard of a centrifugal force. So as it moves, the force that the Earth acts on it pulls it to the Earth, but it already has momentum in this direction. So that force changes the direction of it. So it does actually change so the force of gravity changes the momentum of the skyhook, and that allows it to rotate. It works a bit like how a satellite would work. So how a satellite orbits Earth, and it's pretty much the same concept. The difference is that as something connects to it and it comes down to Earth, or connects to it and goes out of Earth, gravity, that will gain and lose weight, momentum. But the idea is that they're hopefully about even enough that it will cancel each other out. So in general, it should stay spinning. And if there is a problem, you can use thrusters to make sure that it stays in the air, I guess. Thank you. Great question.
Okay, thank you, Junlo. Thank you, Roudra. Anything else coming from the classrooms? No more? No more coming from the classrooms? I think you have any final word, Roudra?
Not particularly. I would just say what I want to say is that whatever you do, you can always be involved in space settlements and their design and creating them. So I think whatever you want to do, you can always be involved in space, and I think that's something that needs to be said. But yeah, thank you, thank you for having me. It's been a great pleasure to speak to you guys. Thank you.
So Ms. Manu wants to say a few words.
Hi, Roudra. Just wanted to thank you one more time. Thank you very, very much for doing this. I just hope to do a lot more. We want to connect a lot more with you. And of course, my blessings, our good wishes are always with you. And we'll talk in the future about more connections, because a while ago I was talking to a company. I'm planning to bring coding and robotics, and later on I was talking to this guy about you. So we are coming up with something, so we'll keep in touch. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much.
Have a good weekend. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
I think that ends our webinar for today. Thank you, Roudra, once again.
Okay.